As I mentioned earlier, there are two major types of physiological responses to environmental change. First, we have long-term environmental or genetic changes that characterize all individuals within a population or a species. These are things like skin color. And we also have short-term functional responses to environmental conditions. And this occurs in both populations and in individuals and is referred to as acclimatization. So far in this lecture on human variation, we've talked about long-term physiological adaptation leading to variation in skin color. Now I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk more about short-term physiological change. Recall that another term for short-term physiological change is acclimatization. Acclimatization is defined as physiological response to changes in the environment that occur during an individual's lifetime. All available evidence to date suggests that the earliest hominids evolved in warm to hot savannas of East Africa. The fact that humans cope better with heat than with cold is testament to the long-term adaptation to heat that evolved in our ancestors. Humans have evolved to maintain an optimal core temperature of 98.6 degrees. The highest tolerable temperature that we can tolerate is 107.6 degrees. Anything above 107.6, your organs begin to fail, your tissues hemorrhage, and death is relatively imminent. Heat stress is not only produced by external environments, but also by your body's metabolism. Humans are very heavy-duty metabolic furnaces, and we produce great quantities of heat during physical work and while seated and even while sleeping. Cellular metabolism is boosted 13% for every 1 degree rise in body temperature. So you raise your body 1 degree, your cellular metabolism increases tremendously. The challenge with heat stress is that we need to keep our body temperatures low enough so your organs continue to operate. In humans and in other species such as horses, we manage this through the distribution of tremendous numbers of sweat glands throughout our body. The wide distribution of sweat glands makes possible the loss of heat at the body surface area through something called evaporative cooling, a mechanism that's evolved to the greatest degree in humans. The capacity to dissipate heat by sweating is seen in all human populations to an almost equal degree. And they each have an average number of 1.6 million sweat glands in our body. And that's pretty common for almost all human populations. Although we all have the same number of sweat glands and we all sweat the same amount, that there's variation. And that people that are not exposed to hot conditions do experience a period of acclimatization that involves an increased rate of perspiration. An additional factor that enhances the cooling effect of sweating is increased exposure of the skin through reduced amounts of body hair. We do not know when in our evolutionary history loss of body hair began, but we do know it represents a species-wide adaptation. Heat reduction through evaporation can be expensive and indeed dangerous in terms of water loss. Up to 3 liters of water can be lost in an average human engaged in heavy work in high heat. The importance of that loss of those 3 liters is appreciated if you consider that the loss of just 1 liter of water is equivalent to losing 1.5% of your total body weight, and loss of 10% of body weight can be threatening to your life. Now, another mechanism for reducing body heat is vasodilation. Vasodilation is where capillaries near the skin surface widen to permit increased blood flow to the skin. The visible effects of vasodilation are flushing or the increased redness of the skin, particularly the face due to accompanied warmth. The physiological effect of this vasodilation is to permit the heat carried by the blood from the interior body to be emitted from the skin's surface to the surrounding air. Now, body size and proportions are very important in regulating your body's temperature. There are two primary rules that govern the relationship between body size and temperature. The first one is called Bergmann's rule. Among mammals, body size is greater in populations that live in colder climates. This is because as mass increases, the relative amount of surface area decreases proportionately. Because heat is lost at the surface and larger sizes have less surface area, increased mass allows for greater heat retention and reduced heat loss. There was a very interesting study by a guy by the name of Roberts, and he studied variation in mean body weight in human populations in regions with different temperatures. And Roberts discovered that the lowest body weights were found among residents of areas with the highest mean annual temperature. The heaviest body weights were found among residents of areas with the lowest mean annual temperature. For example, where the mean annual temperature was about freezing, the average male weight was 65 kilos or 143 pounds. When the mean annual temperature was 77 degrees, men weighed about 50 kilos or 110 pounds. So the higher the temperature, the lower the weight. The lower the temperature, the higher the weight. The second rule regarding body temperature and body size and weight, body size and temperature, is Allen's rule. And Allen's rule concerns the shape of the body, especially the appendages. In colder climates, shorter appendages with increased mass to surface ratios are adaptive because they are more effective at preventing heat loss, because when you're in a cold climate, you want to prevent heat loss. Longer appendages, which increase surface area relative to mass, are adaptive in warmer climates because they promote heat loss. According to these rules, the most suitable body type in a hot climate is a long linear body with long arms and legs. In a cold climate, the most suitable body shape is stocky with short limbs. And there's a tremendous amount of data that's been gathered from human populations that generally conforms to these rules. In general, colder climate body mass tends to be greater and characterized by a larger trunk relative to arms and legs. People living in the Arctic tend to be short and stocky. Sub-Saharan Africans are generally tall and linear. And that said, there's still a tremendous amount of variation regarding body proportions, but we do follow these general rules. So, what do we do about cold? One way that has helped with cooling is sweating. And hair acts as insulation, so the loss of hair helps cool the body in very hot environments. Now, human physiological responses to cold generally increase heat production and enhance heat retention. So the two primary ways that humans can, in fact, improve their ability to tolerate the cold are heat production and heat retention. Of these two, heat retention is much more efficient because less energy is required. So this is an important point because energy is derived from your dietary sources. And unless food resources are abundant, physiological responses that conserve energy have an adaptive value. Short-term responses to cold include things like increasing your metabolic rate and shivering, both of which generate body heat for at least a short amount of time. We have vasoconstriction, which is another short-term response, which restricts heat loss and conserves energy. And humans also possess a subcutaneous fat layer that serves as insulation throughout the body. And there are also, of course, behavioral modifications such as increasing activity, increasing food consumption when you're cold, and assuming a curled up fetal position. In general, people exposed to chronic cold maintain higher metabolic rates than those living in warmer climates. The Inuit Eskimo people that live in the Arctic, they maintain metabolic rates 13 to 45% higher than observed in non-Inuit people. The highest metabolic rates are even seen among the inland Inuit, who were exposed to even greater cold stress than those on the coastal populations. High altitude. perhaps as many as 25 million people today live at altitudes above 10,000 feet. In Tibet, there are permanent settlements above 15,000 feet, and in the Andes, people live above 17,000 feet. At these high altitudes, there are multiple factors that produce stress on the human body. These include things like hypoxia, intense solar radiation, cold, low humidity, wind, a reduced nutritional base, and rough terrain. However, the worst one is hypoxia. Hypoxia exerts the greatest amount of stress on the human physiological systems. Hypoxia results from reduced barometric pressure. It is not that there's less oxygen in the atmosphere at high altitudes, but rather the oxygen is less concentrated. Therefore, in order to obtain the same amount of oxygen at 9,000 feet that you get at sea level, you need to make certain physiological adaptations to increase your body's ability to transport and utilize efficiently the oxygen that is, in fact, available. So people who reside at high altitudes display a number of manifestations of their hypoxic environment. In particular, reproduction is affected. Reproduction is affected through increased rates of infant mortality, miscarriage, and prematurity. In Colorado, for example, infant deaths are twice as common above 8,200 feet as at lower elevations. Low birth weight is also much more common and attributed to decreased fetal growth due to impaired maternal fetal transport of oxygen. Compared to populations at lower elevations, lifelong residents of high altitude display slower growth and maturation. Other differences include larger chest size associated in turn with greater lung volume and larger hearts. High-altitude natives and non-natives display differences in acclimatization and adaptation to hypoxia. These are referred to as adult acclimatization and developmental acclimatization. Adult acclimatization occurs in people born at adult acclimatization occurs upon exposure to high altitude in people who were originally born at low elevation. These responses may be short-term modifications, but they begin within hours of altitude change. These changes include an increase in respiration rate, heart rate, and production of your red blood cells. Developmental acclimatization is acquired by high-altitude natives during their growth and development. In addition to greater lung capacity, they are more efficient than migrants at diffusing oxygen from their blood to their body's tissues. Hence, they do not rely so heavily on increased red cell formation. And this is just a great example of physiological plasticity. There's also strong evidence that some populations have really adapted well to high altitudes. Indigenous peoples of Tibet, for example, that have lived at 12,000 feet for 25,000 years or more, have genetic or evolutionary accommodations to hypoxia. Altitude does not seem to affect their reproduction to the degree it occurs in other populations. The infants have birth weights as high as those in lowland Tibet and higher than those of recent migrants. The most important thing that you need to recognize, that is, what we observe when we see biological variations between individuals and populations are traces of our evolutionary past. Different traits are the result of biological adaptations that human ancestors made to local environmental conditions in a process that began several 100,000 years ago. Instead of using these differences as a basis of prejudice and persecution, we should recognize them for what they are, a preserved record of how evolutionary forces have shaped our species to meet the varied environmental changes that it faced while expanding its geographical range over most of the planet.